There are names buried in the margins of church history, names you will never hear from a pulpit, names attached to graves that almost no one visits. And these men and women died for something so specific that the modern church cannot even identify it, because what they died for was erased from official Christianity 1600 years ago, and what replaced it became so normal, so assumed, so built into every Easter calendar and every church announcement, that no one thought to ask what it replaced or what was lost when it disappeared. They did not die in vague spiritual protest. They died defending a specific night, a specific date, a specific practice they received from the apostles themselves. This is what they protected. This is what was taken. And this is what the blood of those martyrs is still asking you to understand. There is a man whose name you should know before this video goes any further, not as a historical footnote attached to a date, but as a primary witness in a chain of custody so short it is almost impossible to ignore. Polycarp of Smyrna was bishop of one of the 7 churches of Revelation, Smyrna, named directly in Revelation 2:8. He was a disciple of the Apostle John, not a student of John, not someone who read John's letters and claimed influence. A direct disciple. He sat with John. He received instruction from John. Irenaeus of Lyon, who himself was a student of Polycarp, records this explicitly in his work against heresies. The line from Jesus to John to Polycarp is documented, short and verifiable. What Polycarp taught is therefore as close to the apostolic source as anything recorded in the 2nd century. Before we go any further into this, if this kind of buried history, the testimony of the early church that most traditions never teach, speaks to your spirit, subscribe to this channel. This is where we uncover what has been waiting to be found. What Polycarp taught included something that has almost entirely vanished from modern Christianity. The early church, particularly in Asia Minor, did not celebrate what we now call Easter on the Sunday after the spring equinox. They kept something they called Pascha, Pascha, that is the Greek transliteration of the Hebrew word Pesach, Passover, and they observed it not on a Sunday chosen by calculation, but on the 14th day of the Jewish month of Nisan, the exact night that centuries before the Passover lambs had been slaughtered in Egypt, and the blood placed on the doorposts and death passed over those marked homes. Not a symbolic date chosen for convenience. The actual 14th of Nisan every year in every community across Asia Minor that had received the tradition directly from the apostles. The reason they kept 14 Nisan is not arbitrary, and it is not simply a Jewish holdover that early Jewish Christians failed to abandon. It is rooted in something John recorded with unusual precision. John 19:14 places the crucifixion of Jesus at the preparation of the Passover, the afternoon before the Passover feast, the exact window of time when the Passover lambs were being sacrificed in the temple courts. Josephus records that in the 1st century, hundreds of thousands of lambs were killed at this exact hour on this exact day. The priests stood at their stations, the lambs died in sequence, and outside the city wall at the 9th hour, one specific lamb died at the same time. John 19:36 then connects this explicitly to Exodus 12:46. Not one of his bones will be broken, the regulation governing the Passover lamb. John is not using poetic language. He is pointing at the exact moment of fulfillment. On the night of 14 Nisan, these early Christian communities did something specific and structured. They fasted together from sundown, not the way modern Christians fast quietly on their own schedule, but communally, holding vigil for the crucified Christ. They fasted in solidarity with the hours of darkness that stretched from the arrest in Gethsemane to the death on the cross. And then, at midnight, the hour when in Egypt the angel of death had passed over the blood-marked homes, the hour of the original Passover, they broke the fast together. They celebrated the resurrection at the threshold of a new day. The death held in the fast, the life declared in the breaking, the original night and the fulfillment night held together in a single vigil. This is what the apostolic communities of Asia Minor preserved for over 2 centuries. The Latin term that eventually got attached to these communities was quartodecimani, those of the 14th, from quartus decimus, Latin for 14th. It was not a name they chose for themselves. It became the label used by those who disagreed with their practice. By the 2nd century, quartodeciman communities stretched across Asia Minor, Smyrna, Ephesus, Sardis, communities in Phrygia, Pontus, and Cappadocia. These were not small, isolated pockets maintaining a personal quirk. These were regional churches with bishops, with trained clergy, with a documented and specific theological claim. We received this practice from the apostles, from Philip the apostle, from John the apostle, from those who had witnessed the events themselves. Irenaeus of Lyon, one of the most respected voices in 2nd century Christianity, confirms this explicitly. Writing in Against Heresies, he documents that Polycarp received the tradition of 14 Nisan directly from John the apostle. He is not speculating about what John might have taught. He is recording what he personally witnessed, having been Polycarp's student. The chain of custody, to use a legal term, is 2 links long. John instructed Polycarp. Irenaeus witnessed Polycarp practicing what John taught. When the 2nd century's most trusted theologian says the apostolic communities kept 14 Nisan because the apostle John kept it, that is not a minor sectarian preference. That is a claim about what the people closest to the resurrection understood the calendar to mean. If what you just heard is landing with weight, if the idea that men and women died to protect something this specific is stirring something in you, write in the comments, God is faithful. That declaration has meaning in this moment. The collision did not begin with persecution. It began with a disagreement between 2 bishops in the same century, recorded as a face-to-face meeting that ended in unexpected peace. Around 155 AD, Polycarp traveled from Smyrna to Rome to meet Bishop Anicetus. The meeting is recorded by Eusebius in his Ecclesiastical History, Book 5. The topic was precisely the Passover, whether the church should observe 14 Nisan or Sunday. Anicetus held to Sunday observance. Polycarp held to 14 Nisan. They discussed it. Each explained his reasoning and his source. Neither persuaded the other. And here is the detail that matters enormously. They parted in peace. They celebrated communion together. Anicetus permitted Polycarp to celebrate his Passover according to his own custom while he was in Rome. 2 bishops, 1 table, 2 calendars, 1 church. That is what 2nd century unity looked like before it became political. The significance of what Polycarp was doing in traveling to Rome extends beyond the calendar dispute itself. He was not making a diplomatic visit. He was doing what the 2nd century still understood as normal, going to the source, appealing to the living tradition, sitting at the same table with someone who disagreed, and remaining in fellowship. And Anicetus, for all his differences with Polycarp, understood that what Polycarp carried was not opinion. It was testimony. A man who had sat with John the Apostle and been instructed by him directly could not simply be overruled by a bishop who had inherited a different practice. The precedent Anicetus set in that meeting, tolerance, shared communion, mutual respect for the apostolic source, was the most theologically honest response available to him. The precedent that meeting established was fragile and historically brief, but it was the most theologically honest moment in the entire quartodeciman controversy. 2 bishops with genuinely different apostolic inheritances sat at the same table, argued honestly, and shared communion across the disagreement. Anicetus did not charge Polycarp with heresy. Polycarp did not accuse Anicetus of departing from the truth. They both understood that they were working inside a tradition still carried by men who had received it from men who witnessed the events. That mutual recognition, the acknowledgement that the other man was carrying something real, even if the practices differed at one point, was the model the later 3rd century would entirely abandon in favor of institutional enforcement. The precedent the late 2nd century set was entirely different. Bishop Victor of Rome, serving approximately 189 to 198 AD, is not Anicetus. Where Anicetus negotiated across a table with the apostle's disciple, Victor wrote letters. The communities of Asia Minor were keeping 14 Nisan, as they always had, as Polycarp had taught, as John had instructed. Victor wrote demanding they conform to Sunday observance. When they did not, he threatened to excommunicate the entire Church of Asia Minor. Not a single congregation, not a single bishop whose theology he found deficient. Every church in the region that kept 14 Nisan, regardless of their Christology, regardless of their practice in every other area, simply because of the calendar. This is documented in Eusebius, Ecclesiastical History, Book 5. The threat was designed to end the tradition by sheer institutional force. The response came from Polycrates of Ephesus, bishop of the city, where John the Apostle himself had lived and died, where he was buried. Eusebius preserves Polycrates' letter in full in Ecclesiastical History 1524. Polycrates does not argue from convenience or from regional custom. He lists his witnesses by name: Philip the Apostle, John the Apostle, Polycarp of Smyrna, Melito of Sardis. He states explicitly that all of these men kept the 14th day of the Passover. And then, responding directly to Victor's threat, he quotes Acts 5:29, the words of Peter and John before the Sanhedrin: "We must obey God rather than men." Polycrates quoted the apostles to a bishop of Rome in defense of what the apostles themselves had taught. He was not being defiant for defiance's sake. He was pointing out the order of authority. What John personally taught carries more weight than what Victor currently prefers. What Polycrates was doing by listing those names, Philip, John, Polycarp, Melito, was constructing a chain of custody argument that the 2nd century would have understood immediately. In the ancient world, the authority of a tradition was directly related to the quality of the witnesses who vouched for it. Polycrates was not making a theological argument in the abstract. He was saying, here are the names of the people who kept this practice. You know who these people are. You know where their graves are. You know what they taught and who taught them. Now decide in writing that you carry more authority than these names. That is the challenge he was placing before Victor. And Eusebius preserved both the challenge and the answer, which is that Victor proceeded with the excommunication anyway. The argument Polycrates was making would have been legible to anyone in the 2nd century who understood how authority functioned in the early church. Authority flowed from proximity to the apostolic witness. A bishop in Rome who had inherited his position through a sequence of appointments was operating within a legitimate structure. But his legitimacy was derived. The legitimacy of a community in Ephesus where John the Apostle had lived and died, where his tomb was venerated, where the practice had been received from John directly, was primary. Polycrates understood this. Victor understood it too, which is likely why Victor responded not with a theological counter-argument, but with institutional force. When the testimony cannot be answered, the remaining option is to suppress the voice that carries it. That is what the excommunication was designed to accomplish. Irenaeus entered the dispute as a mediator on the side of peace, not on the side of the Quartodecimans. He himself observed Sunday. But his letter to Victor, referenced by Eusebius, argues with remarkable theological precision that coercing conformity would itself be an act against the apostolic tradition. His argument: different apostolic communities had received slightly different practices from different apostles, and the diversity of practice was itself an inheritance from the breadth of the apostolic mission. To destroy the diversity in the name of unity was to erase part of what the apostles had established. He cited the meeting between Polycarp and Anicetus specifically, communion shared across disagreement, as the model of what Christian unity actually looked like. His letter did not change Victor's decision. Victor excommunicated the Asian churches. For the first time in documented Christian history, excommunication was used not to address heresy about Christ, not to defend the resurrection, not to address a false teaching about the nature of God or salvation, but to enforce a calendar decision. The communities of Asia Minor, which had documented apostolic lineage, which had maintained a practice for over a century and a half, which had argued for it with named apostolic witnesses and formal theological letters, were declared outside the communion of the larger church. The institution used its highest available sanction against an apostolic practice because the Bishop of Rome said so. Eusebius documents this. The Church's own historical record contains it. The specific letter Irenaeus wrote to Victor deserves its own moment, because it is one of the most theologically precise arguments in second-century Christianity. Irenaeus acknowledges that he himself observes Sunday. He is not arguing for the Quartodeciman calendar. He is arguing for something more fundamental, that the existence of the Quartodeciman practice, with its documented apostolic lineage, its named witnesses, its 2 centuries of continuous observance, is itself a form of evidence about the apostolic mission. Different apostles had distributed different practices to different communities, and the variety was the breadth of the witness. To force uniformity was to reduce the record. To eliminate the Quartodeciman calendar was to erase something the apostles had placed in the church. Victor proceeded with the excommunication. Irenaeus's letter survives in Eusebius as testimony that someone in the 2nd century understood what was being destroyed. If this history is opening your eyes to what the early church preserved and what it cost to preserve it, take a moment to like this video. Every like helps this content reach someone else who is searching for exactly this kind of depth. The shift from theological dispute to physical vulnerability did not happen all at once. For most of the 2nd century, the Quartodeciman communities had been a dissenting tradition, different, visible, tolerated with difficulty. By the time of Victor's excommunication, they were something the larger church had formally separated from. And the Roman Empire, which had been persecuting all Christians indiscriminately, was entering a period in which the internal boundaries of Christianity were becoming increasingly legible to Roman officials. A community excommunicated by the Church of Rome was a community with fewer institutional allies when the soldiers arrived. Polycarp's martyrdom is dated by most scholars to approximately 155 AD, around the same period as his visit to Rome. He was arrested at his home in the countryside outside Smyrna. Soldiers and a mob came for him in the evening, and the document recording his death, the martyrdom of Polycarp, one of the earliest Christian martyr accounts in existence, describes him welcoming them, ordering food prepared for them, and asking only for an hour to pray before they took him. He was brought to the arena. The proconsul gave him the opportunity to renounce Christ and receive his freedom. Polycarp's answer is preserved in the martyrdom. 86 years I have served him, and he has never done me wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? He was bound and burned. The connection between Polycarp's martyrdom and his specific practice is not incidental. The martyrdom of Polycarp was written by his own community, the community that kept 14 Nisan, and it frames his death in terms of what he had preserved and refused to surrender. Fox's Book of Martyrs includes his death in a context that explicitly connects his pastoral practice to his martyrdom. Polycarp did not die for a calendar date as if the date were the point. He died for the whole of what he had received from John, and the Passover on 14th Nisan was part of that whole, inseparable from his understanding of who Christ was, what Christ accomplished, and when and how the accomplishment was made. Pionius of Smyrna was martyred approximately a century later, around 250 AD, during the persecution initiated by Emperor Decius. What makes his case distinctively significant for this conversation is the timing of his arrest. The martyrdom of Pionius, a document that survives and can be read, records that he was arrested on the anniversary of Polycarp's martyrdom, which in the Smyrnaean community coincided with the Passover commemoration date, 14th Nisan. He was arrested specifically during that observance. The document does not treat the date as background information. It treats the date as part of the event. Pionius was seized in the middle of the sacred night that his community had been keeping for generations, for exactly the reason his community had always kept it. The Quartodeciman communities during the Decian persecution of 249 to 251 AD faced a specific vulnerability that other Christian communities did not share. They had already been formally condemned by the Bishop of Rome. They were already outside the larger church's protective umbrella, formally, officially, by Victor's decree. When Roman officials came for Christians, these communities had no institutional allies to appeal to, no synod to intercede, no bishop in Rome who considered them his responsibility. They were doubly exposed, condemned by the church above them, and hunted by the empire around them. The historical trail from this period thins. Records produced by communities trying to survive look very different from records produced by communities with the luxury of institutional safety. What the letters from these communities reveal, the ones Eusebius preserved from this period, is a consistency of argument that runs unbroken from the 2nd century through the 3rd. They do not moderate their position as pressure intensifies. They do not find a theological compromise that might satisfy Rome. They continue to cite John the Apostle as their authority. They continue to list Philip among their witnesses. They continue to argue that what they received from those witnesses is not a regional custom, but an apostolic inheritance, and that apostolic inheritance outweighs episcopal decree. There is something in that consistency that speaks to the quality of what they had received. The certainty of men who know exactly who told them and exactly who told them and can trace the line back to the hill itself. That hunger for the deeper roots of Scripture, the sense that what you have been given is only part of what the early church knew. I left something for you in the first pinned comment. It is for those who are ready to go further than this video can take you. Constantine became emperor and changed everything about the conditions of Christian practice. The Edict of Milan in 313 AD ended the systematic Roman persecution of Christians. Churches emerged from catacombs into buildings. Bishops who had survived hiding became figures of public authority. And Constantine, who understood Christianity as a potentially unifying force for his fragmenting empire, had strong and specific opinions about what unified Christianity should look like. He called councils, he funded basilicas, he intervened in theological disputes, and in 325 AD he convened at Nicaea, the most consequential council in the history of Christianity. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD is most commonly taught as the council that addressed the Arian controversy and produced the Nicene Creed, the council that defined the doctrine of the Trinity. This is accurate. What is far less commonly taught in almost any tradition is that one of the other explicit primary agendas of Nicaea was the standardization of the Easter date, specifically the elimination of the Quartodeciman practice of 14 Nisan. This was not a minor secondary discussion cleaned up after the main theological business was concluded. The Easter question was a central agenda item. Eusebius, who attended the council, devotes significant space to it in his Life of Constantine and in his ecclesiastical history. Constantine's letter following the council, preserved by Eusebius in Ecclesiastical History Book 3, chapters 18 and 19, contains language that rewards careful reading. The letter states the reasoning for abandoning 14 Nisan in direct terms. The emperor writes that it seemed unworthy to follow the custom of the Jews. The phrase is explicit. The reason given for severing the Easter date from the Hebrew calendar is not theological precision. It is not that a better calculation was found. It is stated as the desire to separate Christian observance from anything that could be identified as Jewish practice. The emperor wrote this down. Eusebius preserved it. This is the documented reasoning behind the decision that erased the Quartodeciman tradition from official Christianity. It is worth pausing on the specific phrasing of Constantine's stated reasoning, because it is historically rare for power to announce its motivations so plainly. The emperor did not argue that the Quartodeciman calculation was mathematically incorrect. He did not claim that the apostolic witnesses named by Polycrates were unreliable. He did not engage the theological argument about 14 Nisan and the timing of the crucifixion at all. He stated that it seemed unworthy to follow the custom of the Jews. The reason given for eliminating a practice maintained for 2 centuries with documented apostolic lineage was explicitly stated as ethnic and cultural separation. The emperor wrote this. Eusebius preserved it. And in the Christian world that emerged from Nicaea, this reasoning was accepted as sufficient justification for ending what Polycarp had died protecting. The new formula that replaced 14 Nisan, still used in every church that follows the Nicene calendar today, determines Easter as the Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. This formula accomplishes 2 things simultaneously. It keeps Easter in the spring, maintaining the seasonal connection to resurrection, and it permanently severs the calculation from the Hebrew calendar. Under this formula, the date of Passover is irrelevant to the date of Easter. Whether the 2 coincide in a given year or fall weeks apart is a matter of mathematical accident, not of intention. The connection between the night of Jesus' death and the night the Passover lambs were killed, the connection that John records with such precision in John 19:14, is removed from the calendar entirely. Melito of Sardis deserves more than a footnote in this history. He was Bishop of Sardis, one of the 7 churches of Revelation, specifically the church warned in Revelation 3:1-6. He wrote in approximately 167 AD, which places him within living memory of the Apostle John's ministry in Asia Minor. He is believed to be the first Christian writer to compile a list of the Old Testament books, and he wrote a sermon called Peri Pascha on the Passover that most patristic scholars consider the oldest surviving complete Christian sermon. For 1700 years, nobody knew this text existed. A Greek manuscript was discovered in Egypt in 1940. A Coptic version was found in the 1960s. A text that Melito's community defended and died for sat sealed in the Egyptian desert for 17 centuries before it was read again by modern eyes. What Melito argues in On the Passover is worth sitting with. He argues that the lamb slaughtered in Egypt on the night described in Exodus 12 was a type, a preview, an incomplete image that pointed forward toward a reality it could not yet fully contain. The lamb's blood on the doorposts provided protection for one night in one location. The blood of Christ provides protection that is permanent and applies everywhere. But Melito goes further than the comparison itself. He argues that you need the type to understand the dimensions of the antitype. You need the shadow to locate the object that cast it. The Exodus Passover is not decorative background for the New Testament. It is the architecture of the crucifixion. Remove the Passover from your understanding, and the crucifixion becomes an event rather than a fulfillment. Salvation becomes a concept you are told about rather than a recognition that arrives with the weight of 15 centuries of preparation. 1 Corinthians 5:7. Paul, writing to Corinth in Greek in the middle of the 1st century, Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. The word Paul uses is Pascha, Pascha, the word for Pesach, for the Passover feast, for the night in Exodus, not a general word for sacrifice, not a general term for atonement, the specific word Passover. In the Greek vocabulary available to Paul, there were multiple alternatives for sacrifice and offering and atonement. He chose none of them. He reached for the word that meant Passover, because no other word carried what he was trying to say. That word is the theological foundation for everything the Quartodecimans preserved. That word is what Polycarp received from John. That word is what Polycrates defended to Victor. That word is what Melito preached about in a sermon that was then lost for 17 centuries. The canons and decisions that followed Nicaea moved progressively toward total exclusion of the Quartodeciman practice. Those who continued to observe 14 Nisan were not simply in disagreement with an episcopal preference. They were now out of alignment with an imperial council backed by Constantine's authority. The church councils that followed Nicaea in subsequent decades made it increasingly explicit that continued observance of 14 Nisan was grounds for formal separation. Communities that had survived excommunication from Rome, that had survived Roman persecution, that had maintained their practice for over a century after Victor's threat, now faced the combined weight of imperial and ecclesial authority working in the same direction at the same time. The voices that went silent after 325 leave a particular kind of historical evidence. The Quartodeciman communities are extremely well documented in the 2nd and early 3rd centuries. Letters preserved in Eusebius, named bishops making named arguments, specific theological positions, recorded interactions with Rome. After 325, the documentation simply stops. No continued correspondence defending 14 Nisan. No more letters naming Philip and John as apostolic witnesses. No more councils in Asia Minor arguing for the tradition. The trail goes cold in a way that is not explained by natural historical attrition. For a tradition this vocal and this carefully documented before the council, that silence after 325 is itself evidence of what the council's authority accomplished. What survived is remarkable precisely because of who preserved it. Eusebius of Caesarea, who attended Nicaea, who supported Constantine, who was aligned with the decision to eliminate the Quartodeciman practice, preserved the letter of Polycrates. He preserved the record of the Polycarp and Nicetas meeting. He preserved Constantine's letter with its stated reasoning. He preserved the names and arguments of the communities on the losing side of this dispute. This is unusual enough to notice. Historians aligned with winning parties do not typically preserve detailed records of the arguments made by the parties they defeated. That Eusebius did so suggests that the arguments were too specific, too well documented, and too widely known to simply omit without credibility damage. He preserved the testimony of the people he disagreed with because the testimony was real. The anti-Jewish reasoning embedded in Constantine's post-Nicaea letter is not a small detail to move past quickly. When the most powerful man in the known world writes, in a letter preserved for history, that it is unworthy to follow Jewish custom, in the context of eliminating a Christian practice that had been maintained for 2 centuries with documented apostolic lineage, he is articulating something larger than a calendar preference. He is articulating a new framework for Christian identity. Christianity defined not in fulfillment of Israel, but in separation from it. The Church of the 4th century was constructing a self-understanding in which Jewish practice was not the route it completed, but the identity it escaped. The Quartodecimans were casualties of that reorientation because they represented the living memory of a covenant the Messiah had not replaced but fulfilled. The theological weight of the crucifixion's timing is not a minor exegetical footnote. John records in John 19:14 that the crucifixion occurred on the preparation of the Passover, the afternoon of the day before the feast. the exact window when the Passover lambs were being killed in the temple. John records in John 19:36 that not one of Jesus' bones was broken, and connects this explicitly to Exodus 12:46, the regulation governing the Passover lamb. The argument being constructed across these two verses is precise. Jesus was killed at the exact time the Passover lambs were killed, and he was killed in the exact manner the Passover lamb was required to be killed. John is not suggesting a parallel. He is pointing at a fulfillment so specific that it requires the Passover calendar to fully see. Remove the calendar, and the argument does not disappear, but it becomes harder to feel. It becomes information rather than recognition. Here is what the full weight of this history asks you to carry, not as a doctrinal burden, but as an awareness. The earliest Christian communities in Asia Minor, communities with names, with bishops, with documented apostolic lineage 2 steps from the resurrection, maintained a specific practice for over 2 centuries because they understood that the night of 14 Nisan was not decorative. It was the night the covenant was fulfilled, the night the final Passover lamb died at the hour of the Passover sacrifice, the night that every Passover since Exodus had been pointing toward. They fasted on that night. They broke their fast at midnight. They kept the vigil between death and resurrection with full awareness of what the vigil was marking, and they were excommunicated for it, made vulnerable by it, and finally erased from official Christianity by an emperor's council for reasons stated in writing as having nothing to do with apostolic tradition. When the connection to 14 Nisan was formally severed in 325, something specific was lost, and the loss was not immediately visible. It did not announce itself. The church kept celebrating resurrection. The church kept taking communion. The church kept preaching the cross. But the felt sense that the timing of the crucifixion was part of the argument, that Jesus did not die on a generically appropriate spring day, but on the exact day, at the exact hour, fulfilling the exact regulation of Exodus 12:6. That felt sense became progressively harder to access. The when became separable from the what. The calendar became a container divorced from its content. What had been a living connection became a doctrine you received rather than a recognition that arrived. The Passover in Exodus is not decorative background, it is the architecture. Exodus 12:6 instructs Israel to kill the lamb at twilight on the 14th of Nisan. Exodus 12:46 prohibits breaking any of the lamb's bones. These are not details that exist to provide material for later comparison. They are specifications that will be met with forensic precision at Golgotha. John 19:14 records the timing. John 19:36 records the unbroken bones. The author of the 4th Gospel spent those verses pointing at Exodus 12 with both hands. Paul spent one sentence pointing at the same place in 1 Corinthians 5:7, but the sentence is enough. Christ is the Passover. Pascha, the exact word, the specific feast. The night of the 14th, the Quartodecimans understood that keeping 14 Nisan was keeping the frame that made 1 Corinthians 5:7 something you experienced rather than something you memorized. John the Baptist uses Passover language on the very first day of Jesus' recorded public ministry. John 1:29, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." The Greek word is amnos, lamb, which in the context of first-century Jewish understanding carries the full weight of Exodus 12. John the Baptist was not speaking in a general poetic way about sacrifice. He was identifying Jesus by category, the Passover category, the 14 Nisan category, the category that runs from Egypt to Golgotha as one continuous act in 2 stages. The Gospel of John begins with this identification in chapter 1 and ends by documenting its precise fulfillment in chapter 19. The whole Gospel is a Passover document. The Quartodecimans understood this, and 14 Nisan was the annual occasion for standing inside that document with full awareness. Melito's insight from On the Passover extends beyond the type-anti-type argument. He argues that the Exodus Passover and the crucifixion are not two separate events connected by theological interpretation. They are one event in two stages. The lamb in Egypt died in preview of the real event. The real event gave the preview its meaning retroactively, but the retroactive meaning flows in both directions. The Passover illuminates the crucifixion, and the crucifixion illuminates the Passover. You cannot fully see either one without the other. Melito's sermon, discovered in Egypt, lost for 17 centuries, written by a bishop whose community was later erased by a council, is arguably the clearest statement of this theological claim ever written, and it almost did not survive. The modern church has partially recovered some of this. The connection between the Last Supper and the Passover Seder is taught in some seminaries, explored in some congregations, and increasingly accessible through scholarship on the Jewish background of the New Testament. The awareness that 1 Corinthians 5:7 is not a metaphor but a category is growing. Hebrew roots movements have made aspects of this connection widely available, but what has not been recovered, what most Christians still do not know, is that there were communities who died defending this connection. That men quoted Acts 5:29 to a bishop of Rome to protect the theological weight of Pascha. That those communities were excommunicated and then eliminated by imperial decree, and that the record of their arguments survives primarily because the historian who disagreed with them was honest enough to preserve what they said. Hebrews 11:4 says something about Abel that functions as a principle for testimony across all of history. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith he still speaks, even though he is dead. Abel's blood speaks from the ground. The text says this plainly: the blood of a dead man carries testimony that does not expire at the moment of death. Polycarp is dead from approximately 155 AD, and his testimony speaks. He received from John. He taught what he received. He died in the arena rather than recant. Polycrates is dead from the late 2nd century, and his letter speaks. He listed Philip and John as his witnesses. He quoted Acts 5:29 to a bishop who threatened him. He refused to surrender what he had been given. Pionius is dead from 250 AD, and the record of his arrest speaks. The night of the 14th was considered worth being seized inside of. What has not been recovered, what most Christians in most traditions still do not know, is that there were communities who were excommunicated and eventually eliminated specifically for keeping this connection alive. That men who could cite apostolic witnesses by name wrote letters to bishops of Rome defending the theological weight of Pascha, and were formally expelled from the church for it. That those communities survived excommunication, survived Roman persecution, and were finally erased from official Christianity by an imperial council that stated in writing that the reason was the desire to separate from Jewish practice. The sacrifice those communities made is in the historical record. The record is not hidden. It survives in Eusebius, in the martyrdom of Polycarp, in the letter of Polycrates, in the sermon Melito wrote, and that lay in an Egyptian jar for 17 centuries. The record is available. Most Christians simply have not been told it exists. What does it mean to listen to that testimony? It does not require changing the date of Easter. It does not require adopting the Hebrew calendar or rejecting 2,000 years of Christian tradition. What it requires is knowing what the early church protected and what the protection cost. It requires standing in front of 1 Corinthians 5:7 with the full historical weight of the word Pascha, knowing that Paul chose that word, that Polycarp taught from that word, that Polycrates defended that word before a bishop threatening excommunication, that communities in Asia Minor were formally erased from official Christianity for insisting the word carried more than decoration. The word exists. The defense is in the historical record. The blood of the people who refused to let it go is also in the historical record. Revelation 5:6 contains something that the Quartodecimans would have recognized immediately. John's vision of the throne room of heaven describes the Lamb at the center of the throne as looking as if it had been slain. Not a triumphant king whose wounds have healed beyond recognition, not a victorious ruler who has moved past the suffering and left no visible mark. The Lamb still appears slain, still identified by what happened on 14 Nisan. The marks of the Passover sacrifice are permanently visible in the throne room of heaven. The Lamb, standing at the center of all authority in the universe, is identified forever by what happened on the night of the 14th. What the Quartodecimans kept, the vigil, the fast, the breaking at midnight, the commemoration of the specific night, was an annual standing in front of the identity of the Lamb before it was written in Revelation 5:6. The Lord's Supper, communion, the Eucharist, whatever your tradition calls it, is the weekly or monthly inheritance of that night. The bread is broken, the cup is lifted. What the Quartodeciman communities preserved was the awareness that this ceremony was not a memorial of a concluded historical event. It was a Passover suspended in time, the third cup raised, the fourth cup still coming, the meal that Jesus interrupted with a declaration, "I will not drink from this fruit of the vine until I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." Matthew 26:29. Every communion is a reminder that something is pending. The feast is not complete. The Seder is still open. The night of the 14th has not yet produced its final act. That is the awareness Polycarp carried from John. That is the awareness that was officially erased from the calendar at Nicaea. The recovery of this awareness does not require a council decision or a calendar change. It requires the individual willingness to read Exodus 12:6 and John 19:14 in sequence and let the connection sit without moving past it immediately. To read 1 Corinthians 5:7, knowing that Paul had access to every available Greek word for sacrifice and chose Pascha, Passover, specifically. To know that communities of Christians defended that word choice before bishops who threatened them and were eliminated from official Christianity for insisting the word carried more than metaphor. That knowledge changes not what you observe, but the weight behind what you observe. The bread and the cup at the Lord's table carry a history longer and costlier than most Christians have been taught. The people who paid some of that cost deserve to be known by name. Polycarp kept 14 Nisan, not because he was unable to accept change, not because he was culturally attached to Jewish practice, not because he was a conservative bishop resisting innovation. He kept it because John told him to keep it, and John told him why. The night of the 14th is the night the Lamb died, and dying on that night was not incidental to what the death accomplished. Polycrates defended it to a bishop of Rome, not because he was protecting a regional tradition, but because he had counted what he had received, and what he had received from the apostles was worth more than conformity with a bishop's preference. These men were not primitive remnants of a Christianity that had not yet matured. They were custodians of a connection, the connection between Exodus 12 and John 19, between the blood on the doorposts and the blood of the new covenant. That the calendar of 14 Nisan was designed to keep visible. Something remains when men die for what they have received. Not the calendar, not the specific observance. Something harder to eliminate. The weight of the word Pascha. The knowledge that 14 Nisan was the night of the fulfillment, the awareness embedded in 1 Corinthians 5:7, John 1:29, Exodus 12:6, and Revelation 5:6, that the timing of the crucifixion was not incidental to its meaning. The timing was part of the argument the whole covenant had been building towards since Egypt. The blood of Polycarp did not protect the calendar. The letter of Polycrates did not prevent Nicaea, but the testimony they were protecting, the connection, the continuity, the evidence that God wrote his intentions into the calendar before he executed them, survived in the text they were trying to illuminate. And the text cannot be removed from the scripture those same councils claimed to honor. There is a reason the early church, the communities closest to the events with living memory of the apostles, with instruction from John himself, chose 14 Nisan and refused to move from it, even under institutional pressure. They were not stubborn. They were precise. They understood that the crucifixion was not a spiritual event wearing an incidental historical costume. It was a historical event with a specific date, a specific hour, a specific sacrificial category, and a specific connection to a covenant that had been building toward it for 15 centuries. Every one of those specifics was load-bearing. The date was not the point, but the date carried the point. Remove it, and the argument becomes a doctrine rather than a recognition. They knew the difference, and they refused to let the recognition become merely a doctrine, no matter the cost. The men and women in this history whose names you did not know this morning, Polycarp, Polycrates, Paeonius, Melito, are not asking you to change your observance. They are asking you to see what they saw, to stand in front of 1 Corinthians 5:7 and feel the full weight of the word Paul chose, to read Exodus 12:6 and then read John 19:14 and let the connection land without moving past it immediately, to know that the timing of the crucifixion was written into the covenant 1,000 years before Golgotha, that men were excommunicated for keeping that awareness alive, that communities were erased from official Christianity for insisting it mattered. They protected the connection. They lost the calendar, but the connection is still there, in the text, in the word Pascha, in the Lamb who stands at the center of the throne, still looking as if he has been slain, still identified by the night that changed everything, still holding the cup that has not yet been lifted. If you stayed until the end, write in the comments, God's word does not fail. I've placed another video on your screen right now, your next step on this journey. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.